If you have ever looked through German model railway catalogs, you probably stumbled over these. The small symbols with Roman numbers indicating what era a model belongs to. Let me explain to you how the German eras work, and why not also compare them to the equally intricate eras for Great Britain's railways. As every model railway manufacturer uses the system a bit differently, if at all. In this video, I will be using the standards set by the European Association of Model Railroaders and Railroad France, short MOROP, the very same association who is behind the NEM standards for model railways. Their original documents are linked in the video description. And despite my best efforts not to, I will also sprinkle in my own take here and there. So be warned. The MOROP discerns between two terms, epochs and periods. Epochs, indicated by Roman numericals, refer to larger spans of time, defined by large political or other extensive organizational events, and apply to all continental European countries the same way, but as such have no definite start or end, but rather overlap with their adjacent epochs. Most epochs are then divided further into periods, indicated by small letters, which refer to smaller changes in the organization of railways, are as such specific to a country and have a more defined start and end point. Therefore, I will only refer to German periods in this video, and any dates for epochs refer to Germany as well. In total, there are currently 6 epochs, consisting of up to 4 periods each. It is also important to mention that the MOROP refers to the epochs as a binding norm, while the German periods are just a recommendation, and most model railway manufacturers simply don't use the latter. The first epoch starts with the opening of the first modern railway in Germany between Nuremberg and Fürth in 1835 and lasts until the formation of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the National Railway of Germany, in 1920. With a length of 85 years, it's by far the longest and most impractical epoch, and in dire need of some further division into periods. Luckily, in total there are 4 of them. Period 1A is characterized by many isolated private and governmental railways alike, which are slowly but steadily growing together. Its end date is defined as 1875, a number which should however be interpreted as a rough orientation rather than an exact date. With that, this period is comparable with the pioneering era in Great Britain. Surprisingly not mentioned by the MOROP, despite being the starting point of Germany's rapid industrialization, is the formation of the German Empire in 1871, which characterizes the period 1B. The dominance of the German state railways, the first Prussian standards, introduction of branch lines, tender engines, and the very first narrow gauge lines make this a very busy and very diverse period, which gives way to period 1C in 1895. But period 1C is a bit difficult to define. The MOROP mentions the completion of the network expansion, which however doesn't quite line up with the track mileage data. But it can be said that in this period the rolling stock reaches modern outlines with the use of bogie express coaches and the introduction of superheated evergreen locomotives like the Prussian P8. The MOROP makes yet another cut in 1910 for the period 1D. A bit of an odd one, as the First World War with its simplified liveries only starts 4 years later. Most notable for this period, however, is the adoption of German-wide standardized goods wagon designs, as well as the introduction of a shared goods wagon pool. Like in Great Britain, the organization of the railways should change drastically after the war, as such parallelizing the German periods 1B to 1D with the British pre-grouping era. And indeed, in 1920 happened the so far biggest change to the organization of Germany's railways, when after the Lost War, the newly formed German Republic overtook the railways from its constituent states. Epoch II lasted until 1949, when after the Second World War, the railways were once again reorganized. As such, the second epoch parallels almost exactly Britain's Big Four era. It took, however, some years of preparation before the new epoch was recognizable at first sight. As such, the period 2A is mostly defined by the continuation of Bavarian practices for Bavaria and Prussian practices for everyone else, as well as the continued manufacturing of selected state railway locomotive designs. but the use of royal indications in logos and names was discontinued. In period 2B, which is set to start in 1925, we finally see the introduction of the modern locomotive classification scheme, the iconic black and red paint scheme for steam locomotives, and the first standard locomotives. Also the Bavarians finally had to give up their own ruling in 1933. The co-optation by the fascist government in 1937 marks the beginning of the period 2C, which brought new identifiers for rolling stock, for example the abbreviation DR, as well as the Imperial Eagle, and large numbers of wartime rolling stock, from wartime locomotives like the Class 52 to cheaply built wagons, and is marked in its final years by the government of the Allied forces. When in 1949 the Deutsche Bundesbahn in West Germany was formed, in East Germany the name Deutsche Reichsbahn was kept, the third epoch starts, which lasts until the late 1960s. Period 3A sees, besides the name change in the West, also some changes to the used number systems. For example, in both parts of Germany, the system used for goods wagons changed entirely, while locomotives for the most part kept their old numbers. Period 3B starts in 1956, when the classes of passenger wagons were reformed, resulting into the discontinuation of the old first class and the renaming of the old second and third classes to the new first and second class respectively. This period sees also the introduction of the third front signal light for trains and new logos for both the Bundesbahn and the Reichsbahn. It is also now that diesel and electric locomotives are built in large numbers. Compared with the British eras, periods 3A and 3B correspond nicely with the eras 4 and 5 respectively. The third epoch ends with the introduction of computer numbers. While these UIC numbers were firstly introduced in 1964, locomotives received them only in 1968. The MOROP sets 1965 as the starting point for Epoch IV and the period 4A. Already 1970 marks the start of period 4B, which lasts until 1980 and is characterized by the introduction of the intercity network, new liveries, and the final use of steam in West Germany. And that is where the comparison with Britain's eras becomes difficult. While time-wise, the continental periods 4A and 4B coincide with Britain's eras 6 and 7 respectively, spiritually, it is rather the other way around. While in Germany computer numbers were introduced in the 1960s and new liveries in the 1970s, in Great Britain on the other hand, the computer-guided TOPS numbers only started being widely used in the 1970s, while with Cobred Blue, modern liveries were already introduced in the 1960s. Epoch IV's final period, 4C, lasts from 1980 to 1990. Its separation from 4B, however, is rather questionable, with only small changes to goods wagon classification and yet again new liveries in both parts of Germany, of which in the West, the 1986 introduced product colors, which saw a widespread only in the following epoch, gave the 4 types of passenger services their own distinct colors. While not connected with an organizational change, it still is a remarkable parallel to Britain's sectorization in Era 8, which saw service-based liveries too. The transition into Epoch V is a bit of a weird one. It starts with Germany's reunification in 1990 and the collaboration between both German railway companies. And it is during the period 5A where many locomotives and passenger wagons from East Germany received the West German product liveries while still wearing the Reichsbahn logo. In the appearance of West German rolling stock, however, absolutely nothing changed compared to period 4C, which is why in my honest opinion 5A should really be still part of Epoch IV. As such, the beginning of Epoch V would also be more consistent with the beginning of the Epochs II and III, which also don't start directly after the respective war, but rather a couple of years later, when the new companies were actually formed, which in this case did not happen until 1994, cueing period 5B, which brought with the new name Deutsche Bahn AG, also the new traffic red paint scheme for most rolling stock, as well as a new logo. And while the paint scheme of the DB AG was now fairly monotone, a lot of color was brought to the rails by numerous private operators emerging after the railway reform. As also in Great Britain, the railways were privatized only shortly after, Era 9 coincides perfectly with period 5b, while 5a still belongs to Britain's sectorization era. The Morop ends period 5b in 2000 for period 5c, but I'm really not sure why, as nothing about the appearance of the rolling stock or infrastructure changed. Apart from gradual developments, like multiple units taking more and more the place of locomotives. But come on, this trend started already in 1933 with the flying hamburger at the very latest, and is not anything specific to the time between 2000 and 2006. And in 2007, we finally enter the current Epoch VI, that brings the 12-digit USC numbers, previously only known from wagons, also to locomotives. That, however, is the only change in the appearance of rolling stock, and also these numbers are only painted small on the sides. The bold numbers visible from afar have not been affected by this change. Many other characteristics the Morop mentions here are once again trends that have been going on for a lot longer and are not specific to this epoch. As such, I'm also not too sure why the introduction of a sixth epoch was deemed necessary, when one could also have called it simply period 5d. But in the defense of this decision, I'm also not too convinced about Great Britain's division of the privatized time into 3 eras. These eras, by the way, and the corresponding German epochs and periods also don't get along too well with each other. Period 5c still belongs to era 9, while Epoch VI equates to era 10 and 11. Try to remember that in your sleep. You might have picked up by now that I'm somewhat critical about this system, which is why I'm not using it in my videos, and most railway historians don't use it either, as apart from the aforementioned specific flaws the system has, which in theory could all be easily remedied by simply changing the norm, there's one issue every such system has, as they imply that changes happen suddenly and simultaneously, which in reality, of course, is hardly ever the case. Even if the changes are due to an event or order that has a very specific date, there is simply no way, and often also no need, to repaint and relabel every piece of rolling stock all at once. Therefore it can happen that pieces of rolling stock from different periods, or even epochs, are prototypical next to each other, while often different pieces of rolling stock from the same are not. Therefore, the years given should only ever be seen as a guide, and don't substitute specific research. Of course, the Morop is very well aware of this issue, which is surely why they often only state round rather than exact dates. But why then have such a system in the first place? Well, these systems have the right to exist nonetheless. Sorting models into epochs or eras is incredibly useful for the model railway market, and one way of making railway history approachable. And it was indeed a fun way to give you a very brief history of Germany's railways. What is your favorite epoch or period, and why? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear about it. Congrats for making it to the end of this heavy and information-packed video. A special thanks goes to my channel members BR151, Contrian, Dave Heise, Flip Schwip, Kay Frankley and Lucas Ilskens for making this video and all coming ones possible. In the meantime, check out my back catalog of older videos. See you in the next one, here at Steel Bridge Models.